But there are some criminals, the most dangerous, violent offenders, whose actions mean that we cannot risk permitting them back on our streets. Yet, as the law stands, sometimes we do.
That is Prime Minister Stephen Harper speaking in Scarborough today. Once again, not in Parliament, introducing this pending legislation that will be introduced in Parliament later, but very much at a campaign-style event in Scarborough, and talking about legislation that would cover categories like brutal murders, murders involving sexual assault, kidnapping or forcible confinement, the killing of police officers or jail guards, and killing involving terrorism, saying that life behind bars in Canada will mean life behind bars. So, obviously, there are some legal implications to this kind of legislation and how it affects charter rights of Canadians. So we thought we would turn to Boughton Law. They are CKNW's on-air legal analyst for 2015. Wally Opal, a lawyer with Boughton Law, joining us. Hello, Wally. How are you?
Hey, Mike. Nice to be with you.
Nice to have you here again. So is that, well, boy, this might be a tough question to start out with for you, Wally, but we have laws, do we not, that cover the possibility of people that are violent getting back out on the streets?
Well, the present circumstances are, the present law is, Mike, that where one is convicted of first-degree murder, that person cannot apply for parole for a minimum of 25 years. And then if you are released, then you're subject to lifetime parole or lifetime supervision. So that's the circumstance as it is now. So what this bill proposes to do is to deny parole for some types of murderers, regardless of how well they have rehabilitated themselves while they are while they're incarcerated. So this bill goes further in that some people will not get parole at all. Keep in mind that those people who are convicted of first-degree murder get parole in very rare circumstances,
right,
and only after serving very long periods of incarceration. The other thing you should know is that after serving 25 years in jail, let's assume for a minute an offender was 25 years old when he or she committed an offense. That means the person is 50 years old at that time when he or she would apply for parole, which is generally past the time that people commit violent acts.
We're speaking with a lawyer from Boughton Law, our CKNW on-air legal analyst, about this new announcement from the Prime Minister today, making life sentence in Canada true life sentences. So, Wally, is this, or does this have the possibility? I guess all legislation like this has a possibility of running afoul of, the constitutional guarantee against cruel and unusual punishment.
Yes, it does, and I'm sure the minister's lawyers have given that matter some thought, because any time you have a mandatory sentence, that means that the individual circumstances of an individual offender cannot be taken into account. In other words, one size fits all. And when you have that type of a sentence, there is a possibility that the legislation could be set aside as being cruel and unusual, arbitrary, and contrary to the principles of justice. So those are factors that need to be taken into account when laws of this sort are introduced.
What is that process? Because I think that's confusing to a lot of people, and we have seen the Conservative government, as we've seen many governments in the past, run into, well, not run into, I guess, but they have legislation returned to them by the Supreme Court because it doesn't pass muster with the Charter of Rights. What's the process to prepare this legislation from the legal side?
Well, usually when legislation is prepared such as this, then the lawyers in the Ministry of Justice go over the legislation very carefully, and they give legal advice to the Minister of Justice as to whether or not that legislation will pass muster as far as the Charter of Rights and Freedoms is concerned. So those matters are all taken into consideration. But, as you know, and very often the courts will set legislation aside if the legislation is arbitrary, if it's not fair, and if it's cruel and unusual. It doesn't happen often, but it can happen.
And one of the things that I was reading earlier is this does have, because the Prime Minister made mention that he understood the concerns of some of the lawyers about the constitutionality of this, that there was some sort of trigger for a 35-year review on some of these cases, but it seemed like there wasn't a great deal of clarity given as to how that would work and how it would be significantly different other than adding some time.
I don't see any difference, Mike. I think that what they're saying is that after serving 35 years, then the case could go back for review. Again, I point out that someone who's served a minimum of 35 years generally will be in their late 50s or 60s by that time, and then they would have to consider the circumstances of that person to see whether or not he or she ought to be released.
Wally Opal, lawyer with Boughton Law. Thank you, Wally. Appreciate your thoughts.
Always good to be with you, Mike.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Of course, anytime you want to follow up on any of these, whether it's with our legal series or whether it's these conversations that I've had with many of the legal minds from Boughton Law, you can go to cknw.com/Boughton Law, and we collect all these interviews there because, this is something that we have seen, and we'll continue to talk about it after this, that, governments, and this goes back to past liberal governments as well. This isn't just about conservatives, but governments very often follow an agenda that puts them in direct conflict with the court system, and specifically the Supreme Court. It keeps happening. How much money do we see wasted on, legislation with prostitution, with marijuana laws? Now we'll see it again with this. How much money gets spent in that system to try and appease, and perhaps, I'm going to say next, even create an environment of fear that's political, not based on actually keeping us safe, but keeping us fearful and motivated as voters. We'll talk about that next, coming up on the Mike Eckford Show.
This is CKNW News Talk 980 Vancouver.